Dominic Cummings is a British man. And I think they actually, I meant to look this up this morning. I think they actually made a movie about Dominic Cummings where he was played by Benedict Cumberbatch. Let me see if that's correct. Maybe it was just an HBO thing. The machine will tell me, though, I have no doubt. It's, yes, it's HBO. Benedict Cumberbatch portrayed Dominic Cummings in the 2019 political drama film Brexit, the Uncivil War. Okay, so Cummings is, he was the campaign director of the Vote Leave campaign, so critical in the Brexit movement, and has been a key figure and commentator on British politics ever since. He has a Substack, and it seems to be a quite interesting Substack. I noticed over the last couple of days that Dominic Cummings used back in 2021 and 2022 phrases like narrative whiplash and was talking about political kayfabe. So it's possible that those words may have kind of filtered into our general milieu from Dominic Cummings using them prior. Thought that was very interesting. Anyhow, this is the article that I was reading yesterday. This is from Wednesday, actually. So Dominic Cummings, Dominic with just a C at the end, and then Cummings, CUMMINGS.substack.com. People, Ideas, Machines, 12. Theories of Regime Change and Civil War. All right. So he begins with a number of really interesting quotes, and I don't think I'm going to read all of them. Where am I going here? Let's start with this one from Thucydides. At such a time, the life of the city was all in disorder, and human nature, which is always ready to transgress the laws, having now trampled them underfoot, delighted to show that her passions were ungovernable, that she was stronger than justice, and the enemy of everything above her. If malignity had not exercised a fatal power, how could anyone have preferred revenge to piety and gain to innocence? But when men are retaliating upon others, they are reckless of the future and do not hesitate to annul those common laws of humanity to which every individual trusts for his own hope of deliverance should he ever be overtaken by calamity. They forget that in their own hour of need, they will look for them in vain. Thought that was very interesting. There's a Nietzsche quote here. The democratization of Europe is at the same time an involuntary argument for the breeding of tyrants. And Nietzsche got to actually observe that. I want to be sure I'm not passing up this Bismarck quote to my own detriment. Okay. This is the one that I cared about the most. So this is Tocqueville. It is not always when things are going from bad to worse that revolutions break out. On the contrary, it oftener happens that when a people which has put up with an oppressive rule over a long period without protest suddenly finds the government relaxing its pressure, it takes up arms against it. Thus, the social order overthrown by a revolution is almost always better than the one immediately preceding it. And experience teaches us that, generally speaking, the most perilous moment for a bad government is one when it seeks to mend its ways. All right? We are in a period like that right now. That is really critical. The most perilous moment for a bad government is one when it seeks to mend its ways. Now, you could say that Donald Trump, under his administration, the government is seeking to mend its ways. And in many respects, that's true. And I mentioned many of those respects, and I consistently say that's bad. The solution to our government is not a more efficient version of this government. Okay. Our fix is not going to come from inside the system. We're not just trying to correct the flaws of this system, which doesn't mean we have to tear everything down. It means that this government is evil. It is so corrupted and infiltrated, so utterly inverted that it is now the evil we were attempting to avoid. It is the tool of the evil we were attempting to avoid. So you can't just try to fix that. You can't just mend the government's ways when it has reached that point. And it's critical that we don't focus on doing that. But the point made here in the quote is that things get very perilous for the government when it seeks to mend its ways because it has kind of stepped back a little bit. It describes it as relaxing the government's pressure. And once it indicates that level of weakness, well, then people have more of a desire to strike it. And then the question will become, and we're going to probably readdress this in a second, how does the government then respond? And does it respond in a way that now its oppression is justified because of those rising up against it, and they are able to force those forces to submit and then bring in an even more totalitarian rule? That is the regime playbook. The regime playbook, of course, includes revolution. The color revolution, the fake revolution, the revolution brought up by media and lawfare and influence and manipulation and corruption, that's part of their playbook. So certainly they understand the response to that to be actual revolution from the people. And the hope then is to mitigate that within the bounds of what remains relatively okay for the regime. But let's continue. Only consummate statecraft can enable a king to save his throne after a long spell of oppressive rule he sets to improving the lot of his subjects. When after a long spell, I hope I said that correctly, patiently endured so long as it seemed beyond redress, a grievance comes to appear intolerable once the possibility of removing it crosses men's minds. For the mere fact that certain abuses have been remedied draws attention to the others, and they now appear more galling. People may suffer less, but their sensibility is exacerbated. And again, that's something that we can absolutely see playing out right now. If we didn't notice the first problems we noticed, we would not have noticed the rest of the problems, right? And if we didn't see that there was a force, namely Trump, there who was inclined to fix those problems, then we wouldn't expect all those problems to be fixed. And so now we're in a situation where we have both of those things. We have had the awareness of some, which granted us the awareness of many, and we have had the model of some of those being remedied, which gives us the model of all of those being remedied and the possibility of that model in the real world. He goes on. In all periods, even in the Middle Ages, there have been leaders of revolt who, with a view to effecting certain changes in the established order, appealed to the universal laws governing all communities and championed the natural rights of man against the state. But none of these ventures was successful. The firebrand, which set all Europe ablaze in the 18th century, had been easily extinguished in the 15th. For doctrines of this kind to lead to revolutions, certain changes must already have taken place in the living conditions, customs, and mores of a nation and prepared men's minds for the reception of new ideas. And I would suggest that minds are prepared and being prepared for the reception of new ideas, particularly in this instance, revolutionary ideas. And I think it is, again, something that we can easily see in our world due to the scale of the awakening that we might personally be experiencing, and the same applied across entire populations, all of society, I suppose you could say. All right. Let us continue. Back to Tocqueville, just to round this out. Though it took the world by surprise, it, meaning 1789, was the inevitable outcome of a long period of gestation, the abrupt and violent conclusion of a process in which 6 generations played an intermittent part. 6 generations. Now, 1789, I wonder if that is Cummings' bracketed note there, because it's possible that that 1776 would have been more descriptive of the abrupt and violent conclusion of a process, that being the revolution. 2 more quotes here that I want to go through. All stable processes we shall predict. All unstable processes we shall control. That's von Neumann. And again, from the regime perspective, you can see that is exactly the strategy. Whatever is stable, whatever system they can just keep running, they predict the results of that system, because then they're the geniuses. And if they're constantly predicting systems, being the geniuses, it makes sense to believe that they know what's coming in the future. And so, of course, they tell us about the future, conditioning us to accept that future. All unstable processes we shall control. Well, if people are acting out on their own, different control mechanisms need to be put in place. When people started increasing the pace of the awakening throughout Trump's first term, but particularly in 2020, the regime responded with censorship controls because they weren't in control of the people's communications. They were losing control over the narrative and over the collective consciousness, the collective belief. And then he quotes President Xi in 2013. Comprehensively deepening reform is a complex systems engineering problem. Now, that's quite brilliant in the understanding of it, but the timing is also interesting because, again, we're constantly told that China is our greatest adversary and they're just trying to destroy us, and they are not aligned with us in any way. It's the opposite thing. They are the enemy of the West, in fact. But Xi has been doing anti-corruption work in the Chinese Communist Party for this entire time. And it sounds like that's what he's describing in that quote in 2013. He understands a complex systems engineering problem to create reform within this system that has been churning along for decades. That's a big deal. So to the extent that it has worked there, and I'm not saying it's fully worked there, I'm not saying China's our best friend or anything like that. Okay. I'm just saying that Xi has clearly been taking on corruption in the Chinese Communist Party over many years. He's going after the Chinese deep state. Sure seems to be the case. And that is why the regime worldwide and the regime's propaganda worldwide are constantly so anti everything he does. That is only rational. Okay. So this seems to allude to that. Now, this is a very long article that I'm not going to go all the way through. And I do hope, yes, it's true that many of my highlights are still there, which is good. So we're going to go through those highlights. But before I do that, I want to just go through a pretty decent summary of the points Cummings made, and then we can get into some of the direct quotes. Now, oh man, I just shared the wrong thing again. Let's get rid of that one. We're going to bring up this one. And this is, as soon as it loads, from X, formerly Twitter. Hopefully it will load. There we are. Okay, so I have no familiarity with the account posting this at all. He's described as a podcast host, and that's fine. It's Collingwood. I don't know if that matters to anyone, but I'm not trying to slight him. So he says, summarizing this article, Dominic Cummings makes some extraordinary and explosive claims in his latest Substack. It's very much worth reading in full, but here are some key points. Inside the components of the deep state responsible for national security, there is growing, though still tiny, discussion of Britain's slide into chaos and potential for serious violence. That's pretty impressive. And you could suspect that something like that has probably been discussed at length here in the lead up to and in the aftermath of the very violent insurrection and the Summer of Love. We have had street violence in the United States of America. We are now accustomed to this as part of our political process. And we have a vast number of people, though I don't think a majority, who are in total acceptance of that. So good governments and bad governments both have to contend with that problem. And you would expect that they'd both be discussing it. To hear about their discussions and what they really think would be quite interesting. We don't get quite that far, only to the point where Dominic Cummings, a person who I would consider an insider in British politics, though maybe establishment oriented at the end of the day, or at least pro there being a government in the way it's always been. He doesn't seem to be anti-government in general. But yeah, so a good government or a bad government would both have to be discussing that problem. It would be really nice to know what the bad government thinks is the future, or the future that they're aiming for. The reason the state came down so hard on white rioters and protesters last year, despite at the same time essentially surrendering to other groups, was an, quote, aesthetic revulsion in SW1, which is basically just their administrative state, at the Brexit voting white North, end quote, and, quote, incoherent Whitehall terror of widespread white English mobs turning political and attracting talented political entrepreneurs. So again, a parallel concern that the same regime is dealing with here in the United States. Going on, and these are just bullet points for those listening to the audio. The last thing the state wants to see is, quote, networks that see themselves as both political and driven to consider violence. Parts of the system increasingly fear this could spin out of control into their worst nightmare. Senior police are seriously afraid that crucial psychological spells that in loco force are used to maintain order could soon be broken. And so I don't know if he's misquoting slightly what Cummings said, and maybe we'll go over it in the passage from the article. But he's talking about that the police are very afraid that where they are, psychological spells are being broken, and that they're not certain whether they'll be able to deal with the consequences. That certain psychological spells are critical for keeping the public under control, even by the totality of the police force. It's all just resting on some kind of myth that, for instance, we could never possibly defeat these people, even if we outnumber them 95% to 5%, because they've got all the bombs and the missiles and the militarized police forces and the rest of it. I would suggest they probably don't. And obviously, we hope it never comes to that point. That would be a dystopia, right? That would already be a failing of the project. And it would be the sort of failing of the project that would allow the adversary, the enemy, to then take advantage of you and defeat you. Like, for instance, in a more spiritual sense, if you were so certain that your project was right and true, that you would do literally anything for it, including a bunch of totally immoral stuff, thinking that the project itself is ultimately moral, at some point during the project, you're going to lose your way and then lose your faith. And then at that point, of course, you're the most easily exploitable by the enemy that you were once working in a good way to defeat. And so I think the same can be true of this situation here. Whitehall pathologies are responsible for pushing these spells to the brink of breaking. Can we see that here in America? Yes, we can. The administrative state, the government at large, the uniparties, pathologies are responsible for pushing these spells to the point of breaking. And I would suggest that it goes well beyond the government. It goes to the media and beyond that as well. It's kind of just the old guard, deeply enrooted in our culture. Senior people in the UAE no longer want to send their kids to be educated in Britain because, quote, they'll come back radical Islamist nut jobs. That's pretty hardcore. Going on, the state has spent 30 years destroying border control and sane immigration policy. He said the Home Office makes a concerted effort, a jihad, to discourage highly skilled migration because, quote, they truly loathe such migrants, even as they actively prioritize migration from the most barbaric places on earth. Why would you oppose migration of highly skilled workers and instead be the biggest proponents of the most low-skilled workers? Well, that's because you're either trying to overthrow a society, change that society's culture, or have slave laborers. And I would suggest maybe all three of those are true. The regime under Britain, which has lived for the last 30 years, also funds the spread of those barbaric ideas and repurposes laws designed to prevent the reemergence of totalitarianism in Europe to defend organizations who spread said barbaric ideas. Remember, we heard from the people censoring speech in this country that what they were doing was actually protecting free speech, and they were protecting information, the good information, while only eliminating disinformation, because if the disinformation were to take hold, well, then we would enter this barbaric time. We would become the savages that we've grown out of being. Continuing. Deep state, whoa, how did that happen? Deep state discussions and fears about the potential for serious violence in Britain have not seeped through to either MPs or the journalism class. So the members of parliament are akin to our congressmen and senators. So the deep state discussions and fears about the potential for serious violence have not even made their way into the government or the media. It's just these deep state actors who are focused on these things. Part of the reason for that is that the National Security Secretariat of the Cabinet Office, which has acquired power from other parts of the security and intel system, is deliberately obscured from political control. The lack of legibility of the NSS is without historical precedent in the UK for centuries, Cummings says. So even the government has virtually no insight into what the deepest levels of the deep state are doing, and the military-industrial complex, the defense apparatus broadly. There's no insight, even from the government, into what they are doing. Okay? Now that is probably a very bad thing, one would think, if the government is of, by, and for the people. But if we are well past any point of maintaining the illusion that the government is of, by, and for the people, well, then it might just be better that the military is operating in a fashion totally opaque to the very government it is meant to be overseen by. It could be that we're in that situation. I would even maybe lean toward assuming that we are in that situation. But let's keep going through these bullet points. SW1's ability to observe, orient, decide, and act has operated for years as a massive denial of service attack on its own perceptions of reality. Constant cycles of ephemeral emotional hysteria and narrative whiplash, while number 10 has no capability to execute priorities. So they can't actually get anything done. They understand basically that things are falling apart. And in order to create the image that they're not, they essentially have to deceive themselves, which then becomes deceiving everyone else. And I would suggest this is something that we can witness in real time right here in America. Polymathanon says, very Harvey Dent of you. And I think that was probably with my comments just a minute ago about what it would mean if the military state has actually taken over, and that's better than the alternative. Let's continue. The old parties lost their chance to fix things in a sort of normal way when Boris Johnson and his girlfriend told everyone in 2021 both old parties are structurally knackered, which basically means they're exhausted and useless. And we, of course, have that here in America. The parties are totally useless. Starmer is speedrunning Sunak's demented combination of A, massively raising the salience of immigration and boats, with B, a set of policies that everyone who understands the details knows cannot possibly do what he's promising. So all the policy promises that we were getting from Joe Biden, at no point did any of those policies actually seem like they had the capacity to accomplish what Biden said they would accomplish. I think that everyone would agree to that. And of course, they haven't accomplished those things. Although, when you think about that in a devolution sense, Biden was A, not implementing those policies, and B, not talking about what those policies were actually meant to accomplish. It's entirely possible that those policies accomplished exactly what they were intended to accomplish, which just happens to be in total opposition to the fake and illegitimate Biden administration's wishes, right? All these things were happening outside of their influence, but they believed those things that were happening were aligned with their interests when they were not, which is kind of just a funny dynamic to play out broadly when you're thinking about these administrations in a devolution framing. Let's continue with these bullets and then we'll get to Cummings. If you're not in the meetings that decide such policies, you, quote, you can't accurately estimate the relative levels of dishonesty and self-delusion involved. That's pretty striking. Terrorists literally being hunted from cave to cave in Afghanistan by JSOC, U.S. classified special forces, have used satellite phones to procure London barristers to bring legal cases against the Ministry of Defense for human rights abuses and won secret payouts of millions while on the run. The British deep state sounds a lot like our deep state. Their lawfare apparatus sounds a lot like our lawfare apparatus. And the ways that they abuse the system for the regime's benefit sound a lot like the ways our government does the same thing. And that's because it's all the same thing. I know the good twin, evil twin. It's very suspect as to whether or not that actually describes how the world works. No, it's this real way as described by the television. Sure it is. Sure it is. Yeah, it's not all the same thing. Yes, the British Crown controls the British government and the US government, but it's not the same thing. Come on. The same system. Come on. They have a king and queen. Come on. Last note from this. The Tory party has disintegrated on all areas. Its membership has either defected to reform or retreated in disgust from politics. Its donors have gone on strike. Its local networks have collapsed. It cannot generate good ideas. It cannot campaign and communicate. In the recent elections, councillors got Thanos'd. And if Kemi is still there in a year, most of what's left in England, Wales, and Scotland will get Thanos. So everything's going to be destroyed. The political parties have collapsed to such a degree, including their Tory party, which is like our Republican Party, that they can't do anything anymore. They have no ideas. They can't even communicate the old ideas in a way that the public will accept or understand. And that is exactly what we saw throughout the fake primary campaign. And again, I would just pause it and remind that I think a potential framing for what we have witnessed in all of that process is Trump first destroying the Democrat Party and then Trump destroying the Republican establishment and all of the future leaders of that Republican establishment, to the point where in the future, we are not going to see them as potential leaders of the Republican establishment. Is anybody going to vote for Ron DeSantis? I doubt that anyone would ever consider voting for Ron DeSantis again, and for very good reason. Hold on, let me find. I had a great one on Ron yesterday that someone sent me. Here it is. Oh no, that was video. Give me 1 second. Oh, here it is. Okay, so from Florida Politics, let me just pull this up really briefly and show you where our up and coming rising stars of the Republican Party are these days. Ron DeSantis, how about this podium right here? Stand with Israel, sanction Iran on Ron's podium. Ron DeSantis argues the U.S. wouldn't exist if Israel hadn't been the cradle of Western civilization. And I'll just quickly read the Ron quotes from this. You could trace back the history of Western civilization all the way back to the ancient state of Israel and the birth of both Judaism and Christianity, and we wouldn't have the United States of America if it didn't trace back to that, the governor told Mark Levin. DeSantis' theory came after a 3-minute rumination on how Israel is, quote, the only country that we have shared values with in the Middle East and, quote, the only place in that region that we have common cause with. If you've been watching this show for even a couple of weeks and you saw all the videos that I played from Trump's trip to the Middle East, does it seem like Israel is the country with whom we share common cause, much less the only country? That's madness. But he goes on. Most of the other places in the Arab world, I think, are maybe moderately leaning west. A lot of them are because they recognize President Donald Trump's strength. Okay, so is he talking about only Iran, or is he just reversing that? But underneath all that, you know, most of the population in those countries, they want Sharia law. Is that even true? DeSantis goes on. I don't see them as being good faith actors. These being the negotiations with Iran and the countries working in those negotiations. I don't see them as being good faith actors in any way, shape, or form. And the reality is that they cannot be allowed to enrich uranium, period, end of story. They are a militant Islamic government. Their view of mutual destruction with nuclear weapons is actually something they think would be fine because they think they're all going to go to heaven in paradise if that happens. That is absolutely ridiculous. Okay. It's also absolutely contradictory to the policy of the Trump administration. Enriching uranium, having uranium and nuclear capabilities for nuclear power is basically off the table. It's happening, sort of thing. So Israel keeps saying they're going to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. That's definitely not going to happen. I mean, nuclear weapons facilities in the first place are kind of a ridiculous notion, assuming that nukes don't exist. And I don't see any reason to believe that they do. But I know that some people believe that they do, and that's fine. Okay. So that's not going to happen. But Ron is speaking against the Trump administration's agenda on behalf of Israel and one of their leading neocons in America, Mark Levin. That's madness. That's the guy that a lot of our peers and fellow Trump supporters now said was either aligned with us and the good guy, and maybe we should choose him over Trump, or was just operating in kayfabe. Is that kayfabe? Doesn't seem to be. I mean, unless Mark Levin's in on the kayfabe, and unless the pro-Israel kayfabe operation to get us to ultimately not like Israel is pretty complex. And when we have to explain things to that level to avoid taking the obvious surface interpretation of what he's been doing, we're really stretching things. And we should do that, if at all, very rarely. Like, we should be able to understand that even if that is a possibility, it's probably a pretty low probability possibility. I'm not saying it can't happen, but we can't just default to that interpretation, especially not having witnessed these last 3 years. And so all those people at the time who were saying, hey, man, why are you talking about this stuff? This is obviously kayfabe. Can't you see that? Ron DeSantis is a good guy. All these people who are saying good things about him are good guys. And besides, Trump failed us. No, No, we have to talk about these things. We have to recognize these things because it's possible that in 3 years, that person might still be going down the same road. That road is not our road. So while the interests are aligned, sometimes those ain't our people. They never were our people. The Glenn Beck are not, I guess Glenn Beck was sort of Ron, but from the Blaze, what was the softball shaped idiot's name? Oh, Steve Dace, that moron. Okay. Daily Weimar, all Ron guys, all of the Republican establishment. Fox News used to blast them up there every day. Town Hall, Kurt Schlichter and those guys. They had an entire info op online. They had multiple media outlets. The editor of Newsweek, Josh Hammer, who keeps going on War Room, and Steve gives him a platform, and that's his business. I hope that everybody's platformed enough so that we know who they actually are, but I don't expect that them being on Steve Bannon's show means that they are fully aligned and on board with the program. But here you have it, a perfect example of how the Republican Party has totally lost its way. And in that, you should see the necessity for the info ops to get rid of all of the supposed rising stars of that Republican establishment, who I would suggest to you, J.D. Vance is one. Okay, so let's go back to the Cummings article and the article itself this time. And I just want to read from the highlights here. Some of it might be repeated from some of those quotes. Well, let's start here. In number 10 meetings, and that's 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister lives, I think, but does business. In number 10 meetings with the Met on riots, those would be the police, I saw for myself, A, the weird psychological zone of how much order rests not on actual physical forces, but perceptions among a few elites about such forces that can very quickly change. And B, how scared the senior police are at the prospect of crucial psychological spells being broken. We can see on the streets that various forces have already realized the regime will not stop them. What if this spreads? Whitehall's pathology has pushed it to the brink of this psychological barrier, and many of them know it. Okay? All of that is absolutely flooring, but I would suggest particularly we can see on the streets that various forces have already realized the regime will not stop them. Now, you can be heartened in that on some level because we are attempting to stop the regime from doing what it is doing and has been doing. Okay? So if we are not being stopped in those efforts because the regime has chosen not to, or because they are unable to, and I would suggest in most cases it's probably the latter, then a lot more progress can be made. And then the question is, how much progress can be made, ideally, how much progress can be made without a certain degree of loss, potentially, without society collapsing, for instance, or people dying from some element of the progress we are making, is which pieces of that progress ideally are absolute necessities for which we would risk the project at large, right? And if we know that it can't be stopped, how would we proceed from that point? And a lot of people would be like, well, we should just grab our guns then and take everything over. Well, no, that's probably not the answer, particularly if we already understand through implication that the military is not trying to stop those elements on behalf of the regime. Okay. And he's using small r regime here, and he just means the people in control in Britain. But I would suggest that the same can be said for the larger project worldwide, even in this context. And so what does it mean when the psychological spells that keep things under control have been broken? That's really profound there. And that the order does not rest on physical forces alone. So it's not the control mechanisms, the real world physical control mechanisms that are keeping people in line. It's really just the collective consciousness and what people are willing to accept as far as behavior goes from their fellow citizens, as far as what they're willing to do themselves. And the guardrails just might not be there anymore. We are in a cage now of our own design that we refuse to leave. And I've been making this case now for years, obviously, when it comes to our addiction to the mainstream media, our addiction to the central narrative, the television narrative, and the like. At some point, we have to be like, oh, wait, they can't even stop us from doing this other thing. Why not just do it? Right? I mean, I've proceeded that way on social media now for years. And I was stopped at times. I was banned on Twitter. I was banned on Instagram. I was banned for some duration on YouTube. But then I came back and I went right back to the same activity, and I would get suspended and suspended and suspended. And eventually I took myself off of that. But the point is, you just have to keep battering down those barriers in the same way, or go in routes where there are no barriers, because they can't stop it everywhere. That's impossible. And so we figured out a different way to route around the centralized system and potentially have impact elsewhere. And now the impact of my show is not what it could be if I was taking advantage of all of those channels, if you just imagine a parallel world back then. But if I was taking advantage of all of those channels, for instance, then the show wouldn't be this show, right? I wouldn't have the history that I have now to go on. And I think that that history speaks to the consistency of what this show has been now over 5 years. And again, I'm talking about myself, but I think that that same kind of model can be expressed elsewhere. Understanding that the guards are down. Do we try to take advantage of the system as much as we can within the system? Or do we begin building outside the system, working around the system, knowing that people are looking for another option and they can't stop it within the system, but that's where their control is. They definitely can't stop it outside the system. So that is where we should operate. Okay. That's the underlying philosophy there. And I think that that makes a lot of sense relative to what Cummings is talking about here. Now, as we go through the rest of this, again, keep that devolution framing in mind. I have talked with the good twin, evil twin thing over years now about the potential for there being a devolution-like scenario happening in Brazil. We saw many of the same things happen. We saw the stolen election by the Dominion machines. I called the result of the election while Bolsonaro was still winning. I was like, oh, this is going to be Dominion result, late ballots, 51-49 Lula. Go look at the results. And we have Brazilian Joe Biden down there. We had a Brazilian J6 down there, which is, of course, itself just the American Reichstag fire. So these things play out everywhere. The playbooks play out over and over again. And so it's also possible that we have the counter playbook playing out elsewhere. And we've talked about different options of where that might be happening. Certainly in Brazil. We've talked about it a little bit with Canada. We've talked about it a little bit with the UK. I think we've probably discussed it before, potentially with Emmanuel Macron in France and some of these other seemingly controlled situations around the world where, despite the fact that the enemy leader is quote unquote in control and the enemy government is quote unquote in control, the country still goes in the direction of the sovereign, fragmented, decentralized populist movement and away from the global regime movement. So whatever level of control they have in these countries is doing very little. I would suggest the same thing for Netanyahu in Israel right now under the Our Boy Blue framing. Okay. It looks like these things are controlled from beyond these people. And I think that that is what is so frustrating the establishment parties as they've always existed. They're unable to deal with this fact that the control is coming from somewhere else and it's not from their controllers. That's how it seems to me. And so keep that framing in mind as we go through this, because I think that Dominic Cummings, in however much of a normie he is, I can't imagine he's ever read the Devolution series or considered whether or not something like that might be happening in the UK. So I want you to, as we go through these, understand what he's saying at a surface level, and he might be describing situations accurately, but then understand that, wait a second, we saw that exact same dynamic here in the United States. We think something else is going on here. Could it be going on there? And if it's going on there, what does this that he's describing mean in that interpretation? So let's do that. As Tories and Labor have continued their deranged trajectory, they have provoked exactly the reactions they most feared, including the spreading meme that our regime itself has become our enemy and the growing politicization of white English nationalism. Okay. And so the race thing is separate. A lot of people take that as an inevitable consequence. I don't believe that is inevitable. I believe that is a product of the controlled opposition dynamic and some skewing of history, et cetera. Like, as far as I'm concerned, just for myself, I get that we understand America largely as a white culture. And I believe that that should be preserved insofar as illegal aliens, et cetera, are removed. And we like establish pro-family policies and the rest of it. And I don't have any problem with anybody like appreciating their kind more than other kinds. I think that's just natural. But at the same time, I feel a stronger kinship and brotherhood with people around the world fighting the same battle we're fighting here than I do with people who are Taylor Swift fans and NBA fans who have no idea what's going on and vote for Joe Biden and vote for Kamala Harris and support the regime's project and are just being dog walked into a dystopia, dragging us along with them because they're unable to let go of their addictions. Okay. I feel more kinship with people, no matter what color they are or what background they have, who are fighting for the same principles that I would call Americanism around the world than I do from fellow Americans who are fighting against those principles. And so I try to keep the race aspect separate. It's not irrelevant, and I'm not saying we should gloss over it or pay attention to it or even have feelings about it. I'm just saying it has to be kept in some perspective. It is not the most important thing. When I said in 2020, skipping down a little bit to another quote that I highlighted, when I said in 2020 that among the general changes to the dysfunctional number 10 and CO system, the oversight of NSS, that's the Security Secretariat, must change so it became visible and legible again to the Prime Minister's office so we could participate in debates like, what are the actual priorities of the intelligence services vis Putin and Xi? Some senior officials tried to pretend that zero political scrutiny of NSS was somehow a constitutional principle. Well, it might not be a constitutional principle, but in a devolution sense, as we're witnessing here under the Trump administration, if they are keeping all the information about what they are doing walled off from the quote unquote government that's totally illegitimate, I, A, don't have a problem with that, and B, am not concerned about the argument that it is a constitutional principle. As I've said many times, I think we are already post-constitutional. Okay. But the idea that the government and the establishments around the government, regime media, the academy, corporations, etc., do not understand what this opaque body of individuals or organizations is doing relative to Putin and Xi is a very big deal, because we see how our government is attempting to guide us in relation to Putin and Xi. And I would suggest that anybody who listens to my show probably doesn't have any alignment with that perception on these other world leaders whatsoever. And I would suggest that you are probably right to hold that perspective. the idea that the government doesn't know what the intelligence services and defense apparatus are doing relative to Russia and China does suggest that something else is going on there. Because the regime broadly and generally filters this messaging down so that the members of government are saying the right things. Now, I don't know if it goes that far in this situation. Maybe they just have no input, but that is still a startling sort of revelation. And if we apply it here, I think it also makes a lot of sense. Skipping down, I read this this was quoted, but Starmer is speed running Sunak's demented combination of massively raising the salience of immigration and boats, with B, a set of policies that everyone who understands the details knows cannot possibly do what he's promising. Okay. And so one of the things that Cummings lays out here, and that he seems very confused and concerned about, is that these different governments have come in. First, Liz Truss for just a second, but then Rishi Sunak replacing Boris Johnson, and now Starmer replacing Sunak. And all of them seem to have the same problem. They are speaking for an agenda that they can't implement, and then supporting policies that won't achieve their agenda objectives. And they just keep doing them no matter how many people want them not to do it, no matter how much worse it makes them look. So let's just go through, maybe we'll just go through this paragraph. Why is he doing it? Because like Sunak, he's caught between A, political advice that the country is enraged over immigration and boats and wants action. And you could say the same thing here, obviously. And B, the adamantine priority of the dominant faction in Whitehall, i.e., the force that actually orients 99% of policy, is maintaining, one, the HRA, ECHR judicial review system, and two, the cross-party university-endorsed immigration and asylum Ponzi scheme. And so the judicial review thing in Britain is also very interesting. Very much like judicial review here, that is unconstitutional, put in place and now called constitutional through Supreme Court precedent in Marbury versus Madison. And so once again, you have the British system being installed here. When we throw off the British system and say, hey, we have this great constitution that we're going to run our country by, the British system just over time changes that system back into their own, and the system normalizes itself. But here is the highlighted sentence that I think is amazing. Being a dead player, optimized to defend the institutions at all costs, however pathological. This is his description of Starmer right now. A dead player, optimized to defend the institutions at all costs, however pathological. Think of that in a devolution sense and what we saw from Joe Biden. A dead player, optimized to defend the institutions at all costs, however pathological. That is what we were presented. And of course, the institutions are the institutions built by that deep state. Okay. Highlighted judicial review there. This is Ruda Cubana is an immigrant that he's discussing. And the old media did not explain after Ruda Cubana attacked the prison guards that Britain does not keep even convicted terrorist killers about to be released from jail who are believed to be plotting a new attack under surveillance, because legal advice is it is unlawful under the Human Rights Act. So a fortiori, Ruda Cubana can't be kept under proper surveillance. And there are many hundreds of similar or worse absurdities. Terrorists literally being hunted from cave to cave in Afghanistan by JSOC, again, as we said, using satellite phones to procure London barristers to argue cases against the Ministry of Defense, for which they've been paid out millions of dollars. So they have set up laws that bar certain types of surveillance and then apply those laws to these illegal aliens who are known criminals and they're unwilling to surveil them. One might suspect at some point they have other goals for these people for them to carry out, and that these hardened criminals, these rapists, these murderers, these lunatics actually provide a benefit to someone. If you want to destabilize societies, if you want criminal gangs to flood drugs into a community and make people want to leave, to move out of that community so that the real estate values of everywhere are absolutely destroyed, everything can simply be then knocked down and rebuilt in another way. Well, this is the sort of way you would do it. You would put a drug cartel there, or you would put terrorists there. What are they doing in Gaza again? Construction project? All right, so they're talking about operationally stopping the boats, right? This is the goal here. And in parentheses, Cummings writes, in simple terms, if the prime minister tried to order the Navy to stop the boats in a serious way, the courts would state that the PM's orders are unlawful under the Human Rights Act. Therefore, the Navy cannot execute them, and the cabinet secretary would tell the prime minister that he cannot insist on his orders being obeyed, as in extremis, both the prime minister and officers could be arrested for contempt. The core operational and political problem of stop the boats could be solved by simple primary legislation explicitly whacking the HRA through the broader issue of the Strasbourg court and other international law angles, though the broader issue of the Strasbourg court and other international law angles requires deeper action. I won't go into the details of this here. And this is one of those moments where Cummings seems committed, overly committed to the government. That is not a solution. If the system as it's set up has outlawed things like that on behalf of global regime concerns, you don't fix that by changing the law. The law is, in our country at least, unconstitutional. And that's the problem we're dealing with now, is that courts will continually decide in unconstitutional fashion, often based on perceived potential harms or argued for on the basis of perceived potential harms that could arise as a result of the case being decided differently. So they have set up a system, they have set up a system of laws that makes it illegal to protect the country. And then they use the lawfare and the evergreen ability to blame one's problem and one's inaction on other levels of the same system. Everyone ends up being unaccountable at that point because it's always someone else's fault. It can always be blamed on someone else. And that's one of the really interesting things about a system with all these different elements. You could just do a small system with 5 elements, right? So all 5 of those elements are pursuing a project together. If something in the project is failing, well, it's the first element's fault, but it's also the second element's fault. And the first element can blame the second, and the second can blame the third, and you understand. That's what we have in these governments. You must therefore choose between A, our priority is the HRA/ECHR over stopping boats. So that means that the policies in place are more important than stopping the immigration, or our priority is stopping the boats. Therefore, the HRA regime plus some other legal barriers must be changed. And he says again in primary legislation, though I doubt that's the best, most effective or quickest option. Sunak chose A. Okay. So the laws and the policies in place over actually stopping the immigration. So has Starmer, but both have spun the media that the choice does not exist and are pretending they've prioritized immigration. And if you rely on BBC or ITV or Sky, you will not realize the choice exists because the broadcasters reflect the priority of the officials, keep the voters in the dark on the subject. And I would suggest to you that establishment Republican media, from Fox News to the Daily Weimar, to the Blaze, to the podcast sphere that circles in the mainstream, whether it's Candace Owens or Dave Rubin or Joe Rogan or the rest of them are all part of that same thing. They are accessing the same power sources that the BBC, the ITV, and Sky are, or that the mainstream media in our country are, and the same funding sources, often for the same reasons. And so they are then reflecting the priorities as described by the officials. The Republicans during Biden's term, man, at the end, that last year, the Republicans were working really hard to pass immigration legislation. Do you remember that? And Fox News was going along with that story and reporting to its viewers every night that these establishment Republicans were trying to get this immigration bill passed that would solve immigration. They've realized that immigration is a problem. Now they need to get this passed. And oh, by the way, you have to understand that these Republicans are solving it for you. But it wasn't them. It hasn't ever been them. I told Sunak he was deluding himself and his plans could not work. He said he understood the complex details better than me or anybody else. Okay. And there is some way to regard that as true if he's talking in a devolution sense, that he actually understands what's actually going on behind the scenes and he's doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing. And sorry, you normie political observer do not understand what we are doing here. Now, again, that might be a leap for some people to believe that something that complex and intricate is actually going on, but we've talked about that problem a number of times. Skipping down, talking about Marshall McLuhan here, who is a media analyst from, I think, the 70s, I want to say, who talked a great deal about propaganda. But he says, McLuhan warned that the emergence of new media always generates dynamics that are effectively invisible to almost everybody but a few artists. So we've had new media emerge in this country, new forms of media, new ways to communicate. And all these new dynamics have been created as a result, and very few people are focused on them. I think that is entirely accurate. And one thing I hope this show does is focus on those new dynamics. And I think we've been pretty successful in doing that over the years, including, Badlands as well. But beyond that, where are the people understanding the new dynamics and what effect they have on the world and on our politics? Continuing, the old political media elites now publicly perform narrative whiplash via new electronic media, but are almost totally unaware of their performance. They memory hole everything, including their own performances. And I would say that's, once again, something that we can witness for ourselves here in America. They are performing narrative whiplash as a result of how they're using electronic media. It is totally backfiring on them, and they are totally unaware of their performance because, again, they have their little bubble that they operate inside of and don't get feedback from outside the bubble or don't care about that feedback. They just dismiss it. Cummings says the vote leave strategy for turning the Tories into an essentially new party with a new electoral coalition was much, much more logical and easier to maintain, given the big historical forces in play, than it is for Labor to cope with the same cultural and electoral dynamics, such as educational polarization and the rapidly changing media. Think about the Vote Leave coalition, the Brexit coalition, as being akin to the MAGA coalition. And I understand that, or I imagine that all of you will understand that immediately because I'm not the one making this parallel. This has been a clear parallel now for almost a decade. So the strategy then, if in the parallel, the MAGA strategy for turning the Republicans into an essentially new party with a new electoral coalition was much, much more logical and easier to maintain, given the big historical forces in play, than it is for the Democrats to cope with the same cultural and electoral dynamics. And it goes on. All right. A perfect parallel that makes complete and total sense in the exact same way when you relate it to the situation in America. And we can see that that is exactly the policy and the strategy that Donald Trump has pursued in that situation. Taking over the Republican Party, essentially co-opting it to our own needs. And we can see that that's been largely successful. The Republican Party now, in its essence, is just the MAGA party going on into the future. I can't imagine there's anything of the Republican establishment left by the end. And that's the point. And understanding that's the point, again, circle back and reconsider the idea that Trump might be simply, and that the media operation at large might simply be tasked with eliminating all the rising stars of the Republican establishment. Because if one of those rising stars becomes the new charismatic leader that everyone gravitates toward, and that person could easily turn the Republican Party away from MAGA and back to the establishment. That's what they've been trying to do the entire time, to eliminate those people and to show them, as Ron DeSantis, as totally unqualified, incapable, and with bad priorities in the first place, is a necessary component. That's actually really productive to do. And I think that that's right in line with this strategy that you can see is being carried out across the pond, as they say. Keeping them happy. This is, let me just do this paragraph so that we have the context here. Starmer has a truly nightmare situation because the issue of what to do about immigration is no longer susceptible to post-1991 SW1 politics as usual. Rich, graduate London, crucial for what labor has become, and I think that these are the college-educated elites is what he's referring to, has radicalized itself, like the Democrats, such that it is, on principle, hostile to border control and treats arguments made by Bill Clinton and even Obama as racism. But keeping them happy enrages most of the country outside London, and Starmer has done a Sunak and enraged everybody. So he's simultaneously unable to please the elites in London and unable to please the enraged people outside of London. And if you were trying to expose the system fully, making sure that everybody is unhappy with how things are going is probably a pretty good strategy. I would suggest to you that this is playing out on a probably 2-year delayed timeline from it playing out here. Same thing I suggested about Brazil a couple years back when Lula was installed. And that's because the situation on the ground is different. The media situation, the collective consciousness is different. It's entirely possible. I suspect it's true in Europe. I don't know as much about Brazil, but that people are significantly behind in their understanding. And I have people from European countries, including the UK, popping into my Telegram chat all the time and telling me about how different it is in their countries than it is here. Now, they're not people I personally know as my friends, but I believe they're telling me the truth. I could be wrong about that, I suppose. Britain could be the most based place ever, but I really strongly doubt that's true. And so we see a 2-year delay in this timeline that otherwise would make total sense. The fake and illegitimate Biden administration was unable to please his own elites satisfactorily, unable to please his base, and made all of us on the other side, quote unquote, hate him. Well done, our boy Blue. Skipping down. Then they cheered Boris, Truss, Sunak as they machine gunned the entire coalition with the biggest wave of uncontrolled immigration ever, tax rises, vandalism on a vast scale, and then declared, see, the 2019 coalition could never have lasted. Why? Because the last thing any part of SW1 outside of some of the deep state, the last thing they wanted to see was the Tories transformed into a different party that was super tough on crime and immigration, super focused on productivity and science, technology startups, investment, super disruptive of Whitehall's core institutions, and supported by a national coalition uniting parts of the working classes and middle classes, super popular outside SW1, but a nightmare for SW1. And I would suggest right there that Dominic Cummings is describing something very akin to the Elon Musk Doge effort, to the info op led by the television characters on the fantasy team. All of that effort that might be aligned with Trump, but might eventually be divergent, sounds exactly like what Cummings is describing here. Tough on crime and immigration, super tough, Singapore style tough, super focused on productivity and science technology startups, investment, right? Super disruptive of core institutions. All of those things are among Peter Thiel's priorities, and they are maybe also among MAGA's priorities, but do not constitute the full list of MAGA priorities and could potentially be counterproductive, misaligned, or incompatible or antithetical to MAGA's priorities. I love how he said both parties cheered by the NPCs have doubled down on a trajectory. That's exactly true here as well. While the new government imploded, the Tory party could not benefit. It is disintegrated in all areas. Its membership is either defected to reform or retreated in disgust from politics. Its donors have gone on strike. Its local networks have collapsed. It cannot generate good ideas. It cannot campaign and communicate. Its communication is so self-sabotaging, they disintegrate faster when they try harder. And networks on which it depended for people and ideas have either themselves died or defected. And so, again, exactly like the Republican Party here. And in particular, I want to focus on the idea that their communication is so self-sabotaging that they disintegrate when they try harder. This is a concept we have talked about many, many times, and a concept I've been writing about a bit lately in the context of like a publicist for a celebrity or business, for instance. And I have some familiarity with that world. I knew many publicists, and then my social media management company dealt with publicity concerns in a PR fashion. So I get it. If your job, the sole purpose of your job, is to make your clients look good and preserve their reputation, and you are actually damaging your client's reputation in service of your own incentives, in service of your own survival, in service of your own success, whatever it is, then you are actually performing an inverted form of your job, and your clients would then unfortunately not know it. But the sign of that would be that everything you do to help preserve and burnish their reputation was actually making them look worse. And that's what we've seen over the last 5 years, and truthfully much longer, when it comes to the media efforts to be anti-Trump. At this point, all their efforts to be anti-Trump actually end up just backfiring and hurting them. And we see that dynamic playing out across the board. At some point, you have to wonder if that is even possibly, I'm not even talking about whether it is definitely a naturally occurring phenomenon. Is it even possibly a naturally occurring phenomenon? Or does such incompetence and so much backfiring necessitate something that is more highly organized? And I'll leave that to your own discernment to decide. Just a couple quick notes here, and then we're finished with the Cummings piece. And I guess this is much longer than I thought it would be, but I hope that you find it worth it. How do parts of Whitehall prepare? These are the issues that are still remaining, okay? These are the questions that remain, like what is to come. And so I just want to highlight these few. How do parts of Whitehall prepare to sabotage Nigel Farage, copying their friends in Europe who routinely sabotage political threats to the old system? Okay. So the establishment is going to try to threaten the anti-establishment guy. Now, some people don't believe that Nigel Farage is truly as anti-establishment as he seems. I am inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt because Steve Bannon seems to like him an awful lot, and I respect Bannon. Farage was key in Brexit and could just be the key player of this movement and seems to be, and reform continues to gather steam. So in opposition to that, we have the establishment parties, the uniparty in Britain, we can call it, doing what their European friends do, which is sabotage political threats to the old system. So in all of these other countries that he's referring to, their friends in Europe, we have the same thing happening. That's happening there, that's happening here. How is it happening everywhere at once? Is there some organization, some coordination behind it? I would suggest there is. And if we understand that it's happening everywhere in coordinated fashion, then to, again, deny in any respect the good twin, evil twin paradigm, as opposed to the standard paradigm that's delivered to us by the television, well, that would be absolutely crazy. Again, we can see the same thing happening, playing out in another country. And in that country, the person who's telling us about it is saying that they're all copying things that are happening in other countries. Ways to eliminate their competition, which are, always essentially color revolutions. Another question: how do other parts of Whitehall, particularly in security and intelligence, respond to the disintegration? That's going to be very important. We're going to see how that evolves here. We haven't reached that point yet, so I can't say I know how that's going to work. And again, I think that Britain will be behind us, but when countries are on delayed timelines, the rate of catching up in terms of the public consciousness is still happening more quickly than it was. So whatever speed we were at in 2019 and 2020, for instance, if they've only advanced to the same point in terms of the ultimate goal, if we were, maybe this is a better way of saying it, if we were at 50% in 2020 and they were at 30% in 2020, and we're at 75% now, let's say, and they're still only at 50% or something, what I'm suggesting is they are waking up more quickly than we were probably in 2019 and 2020, because they are witnessing our awakening as well, right? So their pace is probably quickening at a faster rate relative to the rate of progress relative to the end goal. I hope that makes sense. I hope that wasn't too convoluted an explanation. How do voters respond to the meltdown of the old system and creeping chaos? And we can lose the word voters. He still believes in elections. Who knows why? Maybe he just has to communicate on those terms. I don't know. But how do people respond ultimately to the meltdown of the old system and the creeping chaos? An important element, and it's good that he mentioned it. If you do it too fast, people are not prepared to respond to the meltdown, then people freak out. Are we working at a speed that mitigates that problem while still progressing quickly enough that we don't lose the progress and that we don't have all of these other collateral damages along the way? What new crises accelerate collapse? I said in 2021, prepare for the grid to collapse and infrastructure everyone relies on to stop working. These trends will continue. The immigration Ponzi is blowing up. The Ponzi scheme of the modern financial system could blow up at any time. Now, I don't know if we're going to have a grid collapse and failing infrastructure, though it could be. We could have that. And it's worth preparing for some of this stuff. And I am not going to devote my entire life to preparing for those things because I'm not convinced that they are necessities, but it could happen. Could happen with a reduced scale. And if it happens, I would imagine that it probably happens everywhere at once. Once the regime has reached a breaking point, they're just going to start hitting the off switch on whatever they still control, rather than it being caused by an EMP or anything like that. They're just going to simply switch it off because their needs are not our needs, and they welcome the chaos that would be caused across society. So anyhow, okay, that brings us to the end of that article. I hope that that wasn't too deep a dive on that and that the substance justifies the length